on space and data. Now we have some really great stuff here from TRP. We have Marina Huyn, who is going to, she's a Director of Infrastructure Advisory for EY, and she is going to moderate this session. So I'm going to put her on, and welcome Marina.
Great, thank you. Well, hi everyone, and welcome to the third session today on space and mode, where we'll be exploring new ideas and concepts to break away from the ineffective silos that we often see when it comes to planning and delivering services across transport and public spaces. So our session today will showcase how better use of data and innovative thinking can drive more holistic and integrated policy and planning, and ultimately deliver better user experience and outcomes for our users, both across these space areas separately and also where they intersect. As introduced, my name is Marina Huyn. I'm a director from Infrastructure Advisory Practice from EY. Core to what I do is to support government in developing and implementing key strategies and policies around public infrastructure and services. I'm very pleased to have recently joined the Inter-modal transport data sharing program, and will shortly hand over to my colleagues, Andrew Pickford and Terry Graham, who will kick off today's session on a brief presentation on this live project. Following that will be two other great presentations we have in this session. One will be on multimodal approaches to bus transport. That will be by ZJen and Wrapup Chopra. And our final presentation will be on fresh looks at active spaces and supporting healthy aging by Dr. Sun Yi. So hopefully we'll have some time at the end for an interactive Q&A session. Please feel free to type in your questions in the chat box throughout the presentations, and then we can take them in turn at the end, or also feel free to voice your questions at the end of the presentation. So let's kick off the session. I'll hand over to Andrew and Terry, thanks.
Thanks, Marina. We have 7 minutes to cover a rather large subject. So Terry, do you have the presentation?
Yes, I do. I'm going to start.
Yes. Anyway, so the subject, as Marina introduced, is around space and data. Our focus is, I guess, prioritising this would be more about data than space, but there is actually an inextricable link between them. Certainly when it comes to providing mobility in what we all observe to be actually a 3-dimensional city, not a 2-dimensional city. We have great separation, we have multiple modes, we have 90% public transport market share. For all intents and purposes, it looks pretty good. It's only when you get down into detail of operations and you start to consult with the enormous transport ecosystem in Hong Kong, then you realise that actually things could be improved. So let's take a look at what we found as part of this ITF funded project. We're about halfway through. And so Terry, next slide, please. So this is a team, including Marina, a host of this session, myself, Andrew Pickford, and Terence Graham, the co-presenter in this case, led by John Ewer, top left, and with the support around sustainability issues with Walkraut and the great support of Jenny, plus a team of research assistants led by Dr. Zhao at Hong Kong U, effectively the lead on this project. Next slide, please, Terry. So what's important? Well, surveys say many things. So this is one survey. It tends to reflect, hopefully, a common view. That is, congestion is an issue. Transit policy and how that relates to improvements in mobility is an issue. Of course, this doesn't aggregate it down to the level of detail that you need to understand the key issues, but it's quite clear at this high level. It is congestion. It's about transport policy. It sounds like it needs more work. It needs to evolve. The government's desire to improve transport and mobility, and issues around predictability and speed. I guess predictability is probably more important, since it actually reduces wastage. And again, the government's awareness of the need to implement change. This is the view of KPMG in one of their surveys. Next slide, please. So basically, what needs to change in this case? We all have our own views on this, but our list is around policies, around traffic congestion mitigation, public transport and its operations, and basically willingness of all parties to adopt more of a user-centric view than a siloed view that we have currently. Innovation tends to be internal rather than external, and in general, there's little activities between modes when it comes to policy development and in terms of operational alignment between those modes. Next slide, please, Terry. The program aims of the ITF funding project is to advocate to discover more practical means of delivering a sustainable transport solution. It's about improving movement of people, improving operation efficiency, and its provision of services in general. It has to work for everybody. I improve performance, reduce cost, reallocate benefits more fairly maybe, and the use of data that in our case can actually underpin potentially transport policy evolution. But as we know, data can also be used for improving operations. That's not within our scope, but we do touch upon that in this project nevertheless. And the net result is improving transport productivity, making better use of the existing network infrastructure. And to do that, typically we need to improve the availability of the road network and thereby mitigate traffic congestion. And last but not least, of course, really improving the quality of the air for the benefit of the environment and health. Next slide, please. So, brief run through this, excuse the pace. It is a rather short project, so this compressed presentation shows the breadth, including our conducting global research on best practice around collaborative models within the transport hierarchy. And that includes data as one of those binding agents alongside the contractual relationships between those parties. The whole thing, of course, is wrapped up in policy and regulation. And that at the same time has to encourage innovation, it has to direct innovation, and it has to protect the consumer interests at the same time, plus other members of the ecosystem, including the transport operators that tend to require predictability in their business, of course. So it's a difficult balancing act. The balancing point will change, of course. In order to make things more pragmatic and focused, as part of the project, we've actually identified some use cases, or rather challenge statements, in order to boil down this very abstract concepts we face in front of us into things that matter to people, such as taking an MTR and then requiring a taxi. How do you make that journey? They're very simple statements which work much more efficiently. So those simple questions have really helped prime our conversations within the team. And of course, we couldn't live without the views of other stakeholders actually propping up this program. Next slide, please, Terry. It is a multi-stakeholder project, and we consulted over what appears to be an 18-month preparatory period, around 80 stakeholders in all of those sectors. So we think we've covered every stakeholder involved in Hong Kong's transport environment. Next slide, please. The engagement, of course, in short, the focus is on facilitating pilot projects. So whether we'll get time to deliver a whole portfolio of projects within the 7 months we have is rather doubtful. So what we're doing is actually prioritizing those. And the focus has actually been on Exchange Square and the stakeholders around that. Exchange Square seems to embody many of the use cases we've identified in terms of safety, accessibility, intermodal transfer, in many cases, lack of data and lack of awareness on really where to wait for your bus. It can be as simple as that in that case. And what we do see is lack of collaboration, which reflects the need to encourage that, at least between the transport operators and governments. And also the public, to actually raise their knowledge of just what's available out there. And the aim is to not just develop transport, but actually mobility as a whole. Next slide, please, Terry. So data sharing is one of those binding, enabling forces alongside regulation and user awareness and understanding and willingness. So data is one of those key enablers, and it supports both urban planning, it supports road safety. In our case, we're looking to develop new insights from existing data by pooling data that exists generally in the public domain, such as static and dynamic data around transport and the movements of people. So by being able to analyze that, we can actually focus on the potential to reduce costs, improve performance, and actually reuse data for purposes where it's never been used before. So the crux of the project is about combining data from multiple sources. And we certainly need to respect the value of that data. Next slide, please, Terry. So the basic findings are there is a data ownership imbalance in Hong Kong. We see lack of alignment on the sharing of the benefits, costs and risks between the parties, generally governments, the transport providers and users. We don't believe there's a common view of the value of data. Of course, in many cases it has commercial value. And again, we need to respect that. There's also no common approach to technology adoption. There's some very well-funded players and there's some less well-funded players. And government has committed to invest currently in green minibuses to, again, bring them up to speed, excuse the pun, in actually properly connecting with the with other parts of the transport environment and being able to connect better with the users. And we also believe that technical capacity varies also between those operators. And there's certainly not a common understanding of really how those benefits and costs should be allocated. Next slide, please, Terry. So next slide, please, Terry. In terms of use cases, this could be a conference by itself. And go back one slide, please, Terry. So in use cases, like I said, we developed 14 use cases and around the 7 to 8 themes around simple monomodal trips to more complex trips, late night trips, commuter models, and also how you actually perform end-to-end trip planning from the perspective of an operator, not only the interest of a passenger themselves. So which of these are most important? And that question remains with us as we start to assess the available data and visualize the weaknesses in transport provision at various locations and at various times of the day. Next slide, please, Terry. We're doing this through the establishment of working groups, and there are 4 working groups we've set up so far. We're actually in the process of setting up. One focusing on on-demand mobility services. Exchange Square PTI is a focus of many of those use cases. Regulation, which is cross-cutting, and environmental sustainability. At a low priority, although still critically important, we find that active mobility and first mile, last mile provisions, as well as operational integration, is equally important. So we're focusing on those 4 initially, and we certainly welcome your participation in any of those interest groups, if you wish. Next slide, please, Terry. So we have this concept called the TRP Knowledge Cafe, and so we have monthly, sometimes twice monthly demonstrations, and a demonstration is a private sector player typically demonstrating a new product or service. And what it has done, it's invited the supply chain, including the transport operators, to actually have a 30-minute platform to expose their interests and to articulate innovations in transport. So everyone from that point should have an equal understanding of just what's available. The next step is to agree what's possible, of course, but at least having a common understanding of the contemporary methods is the initial starting point. Terry, over to you to wrap up on the next slide. Thank you.
I just want to say, in order to affect change in Hong Kong, it helps to have government support. And in our open collaboration approach with the university anchoring that approach as the trusted third party. I see that as a fusion of a bottom-up and a top-down approach to address some of the institutional challenges that Andrew just covered. And it's with the Exchange Square PTI POC, we hope to unlock the data that currently resides in silos to build up that intermodal picture and to start creating the evidence that will lead to better informed policy and decision-making here in Hong Kong. Thank you very much. And there's a link for anyone who's interested in finding out more about our program and becoming a participant in it. Thank you.
Thank you, Terry. Back to you, Marina.
Thanks, Andrew. Thanks, Terry. We can now move on to the next presentation, which is on multimodal approaches to bus transport. Can I please invite ZJen and Sharat, please?
Hi there. Can you guys hear me?
Yeah, perfect.
Yeah, I got the thumbs up. So hi, everybody. Thanks for letting us share our research with you guys. So we're working on a UGC-funded project on resilience of multimodal public transportation. And I'm an assistant professor at the School of Energy and Environment, and I have my PhD researcher, Shu, with me here. And together we'd be presenting this project that we have on resilience. So cities, let me see if I can, hold on, I need to, yeah. Cities are faced with all kinds of disruptive events, including extreme weather, technical failures, man-made attacks. These tend to have a significant impact on the public transportation system. And with climate change, these such large-scale disruptions are only going to become more frequent and intense. So it is imperative to design and operate urban public transit that is safe to fail and can bounce back from any kind of disruption. So this is unknown unknowns. The recent Future for Mobility report by We Ride Australia produced this graphic that highlights the impact of public transportation disruption on road congestion, right? A public transportation system that is not resilient will result in the displacement of passengers from more efficient modes to private vehicles, which will further reduce the ability of the transportation system to bounce back. In addition, resilient public transportation in cities can reduce the dependence of passengers on carbon-intensive independent vehicles, and therefore contribute to long-term sustainability. So that is primarily the reason why we're looking at resilience in the context of sustainability and environmental impacts. In Hong Kong, in particular, the public transportation system is efficient in terms of ridership volume, but this high passenger dependency also makes the system more vulnerable to disruptions. For this reason, our project, it has been funded by UGC, focuses on producing data-driven resilience analytics in the context of Hong Kong. So there is a need to design and operate the public transportation system, keeping resilience in mind. So the natural question is, well, how do we define resilience? Well, we use the definition that has been proposed by the National Academies of Sciences, which also is used by the US Department of Homeland Security. So the definition goes like this: resilience is the ability to prepare and plan for, absorb, recover from, and more successfully adapt to adverse events. So the definition covers all the phases of disaster cycle. So that's both pre as well as post disruption. So this is sort of your disruption cycle. And so the preparedness phase focuses on identifying the sources of systemic vulnerability. Robustness is focused on, as soon as you have the disruption, the ability of the system to withstand the disruption and curtail the spread of that any cascading impacts. Recovery phase aims at identifying optimal strategies to respond to the disruption. And lastly, the adaptation phase is focused on learning from previous phases to improve the preparedness of the system for the next cycle. So this framework presents a comprehensive view of resilience, unlike other frameworks that we've had in the past that only looked at either just one mode or would only focus on one of these phases. So either they'd look at preparedness or recovery and call it resilience. So what we're trying to do is a very comprehensive study here. So now Shu will describe the model and a few applications of the resilience analytics that we are planning to develop.
Okay, hi. Thank you, Dr. Shora. Let me share my screen. Yeah. So I will briefly introduce the modeling approach of multimodal public transport and then show some of the use cases in our framework in different phases. So first, we model the transport systems as networks. So for multiple nodes, modes, we understand them as a multi-layer network. And to connect different layers, we identify the intermodal nodes and edges. And for example, we have a map here near the Hangzhou MTR station, and the gray areas are buildings. And this building is integrating different transport services to be a public transport interchange, the PTI. So all nodes within the PTI can be combined to intermodal nodes. And there are also bus stops in the vicinity, which are accessible by several minutes walking on the street. Here we can introduce the intermodal edges. And then for the utility of the framework, let me show some of the use cases. And for preparedness, we are actually finding the source of vulnerability in the network. And take a metro network as an example. Here we show one of our indicators for vulnerability, the betweening centrality. You can simply understand it as the structural importance of the station to the entire network. And we rank the station by this metric to identify the top stations that are considered as source of vulnerability in the network. And the transit line between the stations are critical edges. The disruption on them have a significant impact on the network functionality. And the analysis is quite useful for planning. And also for the robustness, we examine whether the system can afford to fail. And through simulations, we plot the degradation curves. And with it, we can quickly know how much functionality will be lost in a certain level of disruption. And for example, with about 10% of stations in disruption, we will lose more than 40% of passenger flows in the network. Also, the curve can produce a score by integral. Then we can look into the temporal variation of the robustness scores in different time of the day, which can be useful for operators to manage the spread of the disruption. And for recovery phase, here I introduce one of the scenarios, the relocation of passengers. Simply, what we mean by relocation is whether the passengers can find an alternative of transport near a disrupted station. It's good for people if there's redundant accessibility to transport service. Such relocation capability is quantified, and both commuters and operators can use the information to organize the redundant routes during a disruption event. And for the adaptation, it is understood in a planning way. When we plan to expand the infrastructure to serve more people, it's meaningful to also look at the change of system resilience. And during the examinations, we can identify the potential new connections in the network that can significantly improve the system resilience. And in addition, we can also look into the trade-offs between different indicators in terms of resilience that can be further integrated with the decision-making process. Okay, now I give it back to Dr. Shora.
Thank you. So you stop sharing your screen.
Oh, okay.
Can you share your screen again? Yeah, I just wanted to end by saying that currently the data that we're using to model our resilience analytics is the transport characteristic survey, which is quite outdated. And so we really encourage data sharing between various operators for enhancing and actually utilizing the resilience analytics that we're developing. So thank you for having us, and this is all from us.
Great, thanks very much for that presentation. Can I please hand over to Dr. Sun Yi on active spaces?
Yes. Hello.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, James and Marina, for having me here to introduce this humble work about the active open spaces and how and why active open spaces is quite important for future populations against the background of population aging in Hong Kong. And my name is Sun Yi, and I come from the Polytechnic Universities, and I was trained as an urban planner. So very simple, my research is to look into how the changes of built environment can have a positive bearings on older people in terms of encouraging their physical activities, social interations, and as well as their good mood. So this project is actually funded by the Public Policy Research Funding Scheme from the Policy Innovation and Coordination Office from the Hong Kong government. And I focus my study in Hong Kong, and I think this background information is very important in particular for planners. So we need to be very sensitive to the high density urban environment context in Hong Kong. And currently we have 7.5 million populations. And I did a simple calculations in Hong Kong because we only have 25% of land are built up areas. That means per kilometer, the land accommodates more than 26,000 persons. So the planning and design for active open spaces or any planning initiatives for workabilities, public spaces should be aware of these high density situations. And I was enlightened by this City of Wellbeing map, and this has been introduced by one of my colleagues in UK, who argued that the people's well-being is not only affected by people themselves, but through a nested geographies ranging from their immediate environments such as community and neighborhood to the built environment, natural environment, and even global system at large. So the changes of built environment is able to affect or inform activities at an inner scale, which will finally affect the lifestyles of people and which will ultimately change the lifestyles and have a great impact on people's health and well-being. So built environment matters, and particularly for high density city like Hong Kong, the characteristics of built environment or placemaking plays a very important role in facilitate citizens' health and active living lifestyles. I define my focus of studies specifically on the older people because currently in Hong Kong, more than 70% of population are age 65 and above. And if you take a look at this figure, it indicates that when people become older, chances that they have acute diseases become lower, and more risk factors come from environment. For example, frailty, falls, fractures, so on and so forth. So the change or the environment, older people become very sensitive to the change of environment as they age. And before I start, I'll talk a little bit on the theory part. And I borrow my insight from this person environment fit series, which generally talks about the co-constitution about older people and environment in making a good life. Here, environment include both the physical environment and social environment, and the certain characteristics of the environment can have implications for people, in particular older people, in terms of their willingness to do physical activities, in terms of willingness to socialize, also in terms of enhancement of their psychological well-being. So environment and people themselves are co-constituted. When we talk about aging in place, we are talking about planning age-friendly cities and communities in Hong Kong, which should focus on the one hand, the characteristics of the environment, on the other hand, and people their own competence. And in this study, I give examples here. When people are young, they are very energetic, they have full competence, and they live in a simple community. So the community can fulfill people's needs when they are young. So when people get old, their competence may decline. So the same environment setting may not be able to produce or satisfy the needs of people when they get old. So they comes to this malfunction range. So what planners should do, I think what we should do is try the ways to provide environmental stimuli so that over people, we can recreate a person environmental fit. Okay, so this is the basic ideas, conceptual framework I have in designing this research. So when it talks about person environment fit, we talk about good environmental characteristics, and we talk about people's own competence. And existing literature we review suggests that place attachment is one of the very important personally owned competence. Think about if people living in regional communities for more than 3 or 4 decades, he or she will be very familiar with where to get the resources. She or he psychologically will have a strong feelings of embeddedness in that community. And chances are that people, when they're getting old, they're willing to, or they tend to continuously maintain their active interaction with the environment. So here I argue that apart from good environmental factors, place attachment, place satisfactions are some of the important people-oriented competence that constitute to aging well and constitute to older people's health and well-being. And I will use the pilot studies in Chunwan because it's a first generation new towns, which is currently under a consequent trend of urban renewal. And we do a mixed method research. And in this study, we do the questionnaire we do the questionnaire research plus semi-structured interviews. And in the interest of time, I will highlight some of the important findings we have. The first thing is that we found built environment factors, including the buildings, community facilities, and social environment can predict place attachment. That means if building is well maintained, if there is a diversity of community facilities, or if the place is socially rich, that means the place is able to provide sufficient open spaces for people to socialize and interact. These kind of characteristics are conducive to the development of place attachment for older people. And the second thing is that, very interesting, seeing the greening or feeling the quietness of the space is not enough for producing place attachment. We find it's very interesting because in general, people will think that we provide sufficient amount of greening and we make the place quiet enough for people to stay and to enjoy themselves is very important. However, this kind of place characteristics do not have powerful effects to improve the place attachment. Third, when talks about place attachment, older people seems to be more appreciated in terms of the utilization of the place. That means people are more likely to appreciate the usefulness of the place in supporting their daily life than place identity. What does that mean? Place identity means an extension of self-identity. That means place an individual in a place and develop a self-identity. And in this case, we find that older people in Hong Kong develops more instrumental values about place. That means they tend to, when they have place attachment, they tend to explore the usefulness of a place. Then it's not easy, it's not difficult to imagine why seeing or staying closely with nature is not powerful enough to produce place attachment for older people in Hong Kong. So a planning and design needs to consider a variety of community facilities, and more importantly, these facilities, these open spaces should be active enough to encourage people to have social interactions, to do physical activities, to develop or to trigger their willingness to explore the resources in a place. Having said that, it seems like being active is very important, in particularly against a high density context in Hong Kong. So that highlights the importance of why promotion of workability is of considerable priorities for Hong Kong's planning and for Hong Kong's planners as well. And we do a simple calculations by using the data from the statistics and using the data from the land use data. And we calculate a workability index using a similar formula adapted from the United States and European countries. The reasons why we use this standardized formula is because we want to have an international comparison of the extent to which Hong Kong is positioned in terms of the promotion of workability. So the higher score is, the higher levels of workability a unique areas get. So in this figure, you will see that the old downtown areas and Hong Kong Island have the highest level of workability, whereas the new towns and the island areas seems to have relatively lower levels of workability. But we try to do some interviews with planners and government officials in planning department to understand the reasons why, and we find that zoning matters. In the old urban downtown areas and Kowloon, the zoning is quite fragmented and the scale of each zone is quite smaller. That is to facilitate a very compact development with mixed land use to enhance the efficiency of socio-economic activities as well as traveling and daily commute. Whereas in new towns, there is a trend of gardens influenced by a trend of garden cities, influenced by a change in planning paradigms in Hong Kong to promote public civic squares. So the zonings for the scale for each zone is relatively larger. That's the reasons why the land use mix become lower. The reasons why land use mix is important is because when we calculate workability index, land use mix, residential density, and road connectivity are three important indicators we have. Behind this thing, it seems like old urban areas doing quite well in terms of the promotion of workability, whereas the new towns seem to lag a little bit behind in terms of promotion of workability. However, we find that it's not because people deliberatively create a mixed land use for enhancing the workability in Hong Kong. It is because the planning paradigms in different period of time, although in new towns, the scale for each zoning is larger, but because of this larger zone, we have spaces for recreational facilities, we have land for open spaces for greening. So it's always a checks and balances. So I think this is the preliminary studies we have so far. And I think in the future, it is more important to identify if people living in this objectively measured high workability area do have a higher willingness to work or do review a higher behavior change to work instead of using automobiles. Studies from United States and European countries has demonstrated that this objectively measured workability index can reflect the real behaviors of people when they work in their own communities. So we hope to demonstrate whether or not this is a similar trend in Hong Kong, so that planners can simply use this workability index as a workability assessment tools for future urban renewal and new towns development. As a conclusion, I think placemaking is very important. Equally important is people's lived experiences in cities. We're planning cities for people. So people's life and livelihood, people's well-being is very important. And planning is thus a matter of life and death. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Sun Yi, for that very insightful presentation there. I think we're out of time for Q&A, unfortunately, so I might just hand back to James to carry on with the next session.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, Marina. Thanks, that's great. Yes, we did try to pack in quite a lot into that one session, so thanks for handling all that. And if there's any questions, people can always email us and we'll follow up with the panelists there. So thank you, Marina. Okay.